My name is Caitlin Reed. I'm 27 years old, and I'm a captain in the United States Army. 3 days after we buried my grandmother, the man I'd called father my entire life, Douglas Blackwell, cornered me in her study. The smell of old oak and leather-bound books, mixed with the expensive tobacco from his cigar. He stared at my dress uniform, his eyes as cold as steel. "That uniform doesn't wash the civilian out of you," he hissed. "You don't have a drop of Blackwell blood. You are not her granddaughter. You will not get a single cent." His words were like a volley of rounds hitting my chest. My entire life had been an attempt to earn his respect, and now he wasn't just taking my future, he was erasing my past. But he didn't know that in his blind rage, he had just handed me the ultimate weapon. His own oath about bloodlines would become his tomb. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe honor isn't in blood, but in action. This story is for anyone who has ever been made to feel like an outsider by their own family. For 27 years, my grandmother Eleanor's study had been my sanctuary. It was the heart of the Blackwell estate in the old money suburbs of Philadelphia's Main Line, a room that smelled of history, of aged leather, polished mahogany, and the faint, sweet scent of the pipe tobacco she used to smoke. It was a place of quiet strength, of unconditional acceptance. Today, it was a war zone. The air, usually so calm, was thick with a hostility I could taste. I was standing by the large bay window, looking out at the manicured lawns turning gold in the late autumn light, my dress uniform feeling like a suit of armor. I had come in here to feel close to her one last time before I had to drive back to my base. The door opened without a knock. Douglas Blackwell entered, a heavy crystal tumbler of amber whiskey in his hand. He was a man who didn't walk into a room, he occupied it. His suit was impeccably tailored, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He scanned me from the tips of my polished boots to the top of my head, a familiar, condescending smirk twisting his lips as his eyes settled on my uniform. "Still playing soldier, Caitlin?" he asked, his voice a low drawl of practiced mockery. "I thought after we put my mother in the ground, you might take off the costume and act like a normal person." Every word was a needle, expertly inserted into the old, aching wound of the daughter who was never quite enough. Never smart enough for my Ivy League brothers, never ruthless enough for him. But the army had taught me how to face an enemy. It taught me discipline. So, I straightened my spine, clasped my hands behind my back in parade rest, and waited. I recognized this for what it was, the preparatory fire before the main assault. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine. As he set the glass down on her antique desk, he moved with a deliberate carelessness. His elbow caught the edge of a silver frame, a picture of me and my grandmother, taken on my commissioning day. It clattered face down onto the hardwood floor. He glanced down at it, a flicker of something ugly in his eyes before he used the polished toe of his Italian leather shoe to nudge it under the desk, like sweeping away a piece of trash. The sight sent a jolt of ice-cold fury through me. But my face remained a mask. My training kicked in. Do not react. Observe. "You are not her granddaughter," he said, the words dropping into the silence like stones. He slammed the glass down on the desk, the impact so hard that whiskey sloshed over the rim, staining the polished wood. "Your mother deceived this entire family. And my mother, in the weakness of her old age, indulged the lie." He began to circle me then, slow and predatory, like a shark sizing up its prey. The room, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. "The Blackwell legacy," he continued, his voice dripping with venom, "is for those who carry Blackwell blood. Clean. Pure. Not for some bastard we took in." Bastard. The word hung in the air, thick and vile. I felt my chest tighten, the air squeezed from my lungs as if by a physical force, but on the outside, I was a fortress. In the military, we call it a poker face. It's the art of showing nothing when a storm is raging inside you. My storm was a hurricane. Douglas was drunk on his own power now, savoring the attack. My lawyer, Harrison Mills, will ensure the will is executed in that spirit. You will not get a single cent from my mother's estate. And that's when another kind of training took over. Not just the discipline to stand still, but the tactical mind to see an opening. A memory, sharp and clear, flashed in my mind. A seer instructor, his face inches from mine, screaming through simulated interrogation. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. They will use your emotions against you. Don't let them. Think, analyze, exploit. Douglas was so blinded by his own arrogance, so lost in his monologue of power, that he couldn't see the tactical error he was making. I met his gaze, my voice steady, betraying none of the chaos inside me. I kept it level, almost conversational. So I can understand your promise, your oath, is that this legacy is only for those with a direct blood relationship to Eleanor Blackwell? Is that correct? The question caught him off guard. He expected tears. He expected a fight. He didn't expect a calm request for clarification. His ego swelled, seeing it as my surrender to his logic. Exactly, he boomed, a triumphant sneer spreading across his face. That is my oath. This fortune stays with true Blackwell blood. He had no idea he had just walked directly into a minefield of his own making, and I was the one with my finger on the detonator. He drained his glass, slammed it back on the desk, and turned to leave, casting one last look of disgust over his shoulder. Have a good life playing soldier, Caitlin. It's all you've got. The door clicked shut, leaving a silence that was louder than his shouting. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. My legs felt weak. I sank into my grandmother's worn leather chair, the one that still held the faint scent of her perfume. The emptiness she left behind was a physical ache in the room, in my heart. Her last words to me in the hospital echoed in my mind. She had gripped my hand, her knuckles frail, but her eyes still sharp, still commanding. Caitlin, she'd whispered, her voice thin but firm. Trust your instincts. Not all battles are fought on a battlefield. At the time, I thought she was talking about my career, about the political games within the military. Now, sitting in the ruins of my life, I understood. She knew this was coming. She knew Douglas. This wasn't just a dying woman's advice. It was a final directive. It was a map for the war to come, handed to me by my true commanding officer, and it was my duty to see it through. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. A text message glowed on the screen. It was from my mother. We need to talk. I stared at the words, a cold resolve settling over me, extinguishing the last embers of my grief and fury. The mission had begun. The first intelligence briefing was about to start. The text message led me to a small coffee shop in Old City, Philadelphia, a world away from the suffocating opulence of the Blackwell estate. The air inside was thick with the rich, comforting smells of roasted coffee beans and baked pastries, a manufactured coziness that served as a temporary safe zone. My mother, Catherine, was already tucked into a corner booth. She looked like she'd aged 10 years since the funeral. The lines around her eyes were no longer faint traces of laughter, but deep canyons of worry and regret. She looked up as I approached, her eyes wide and haunted. She reached for my hand as I slid into the booth. Her fingers were ice cold. Caitlin, I am so sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I was so weak. It wasn't what I wanted to hear. Apologies were a currency I no longer dealt in. They couldn't undo 27 years of navigating a minefield I never knew existed. I wasn't here for comfort. I was here for intelligence. I needed to understand the strategic landscape of the lie that had defined my life. I gently withdrew my hand from hers, a deliberate disengagement. I don't need an apology, Mom, I said, my voice low and steady. I need the truth, the whole truth. As she began to speak, her words painting a sad, familiar story of a tragic love affair with my Uncle James and the suffocating manipulation of Douglas, my mind drifted. The scent of espresso faded, replaced by the memory of roasted turkey and simmering resentment. My mind landed on a Thanksgiving dinner years ago. I was 16, and the heavy gold medal from the state track and field championship was a satisfying weight in my jacket pocket. I was the fastest girl in Pennsylvania. I'd waited all evening for the right moment to share my victory. But at the Blackwell table, there was no lull. only Douglas holding court. He pontificated about my brother Thomas's Wall Street internship and lauded William's near-perfect LSAT scores. They were the heirs, the brilliant minds destined to carry the family name. I was the athlete, the anomaly. When I finally found a sliver of silence, I pulled the medal from my pocket, its surface gleaming under the chandelier. I won the state championship, I said, my voice smaller than I'd intended. Douglas paused, his wine glass halfway to his lips. He glanced at the medal with a dismissive smirk. Running around a track? That's nice, he said, turning to refill his glass. At least it helps you stay in shape. And that was it. The conversation shifted back to William's law school applications. I felt myself shrink, becoming invisible at my own family's table. The gold medal in my hand suddenly felt cheap, like a trinket from a gumball machine. It was worthless. My mother's voice, strained with pain, pulled me from one memory only to throw me into another, sharper and more wounding. The worst one. My graduation day from West Point. It was supposed to be the proudest day of my life. After 4 years of relentless exertion, I was finally becoming an officer in the U.S. Army. My grandmother Ella Lanar was in the front row, her face beaming, tears of pride in her eyes. She understood sacrifice. She understood duty. And Douglas? He stood in the back, glued to his phone, barking orders about a corporate merger. He didn't see me toss my cap in the air or take the oath. The real humiliation came later, at the celebratory dinner. A family friend, a retired judge, clapped Douglas on the back. You must be incredibly proud of your daughter, Douglas. A captain. Quite an accomplishment. Douglas let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like breaking glass. He took a theatrical sip of his scotch. Proud, he said, his voice loud enough for the entire table to hear. I'm just glad the government is paying for her little rebellion. At least there, she's learning to follow orders. Laughter erupted around the table, polite, sycophantic laughter from people who depended on his goodwill. In that moment, I wanted the polished floor of that 5-star restaurant to crack open and swallow me whole. My calling, my commitment, the path I had bled for. In his eyes, it was just a joke. I saw my grandmother shoot him a look so cold it could have frozen fire, but the damage was done. The wound was inflicted, deep and public. A quote from a book she had given me, Brené Brown's Daring Greatly, surfaced in my mind. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. For years, I had thought my vulnerability was my desperate need for his approval. I had been wrong. You are James's daughter. The words cut through the haze of memory, pulling me back to the coffee shop with the force of a physical shock. My mother was looking at me, her eyes pleading. You are James's daughter, she repeated, which makes you Eleanor's biological granddaughter. The information didn't hit me like a revelation. It landed like a tactical strike, an executed piece of intelligence that changed everything. It didn't magically erase 27 years of pain, but it instantly reframed the battlefield. Douglas had come at me with the weapon of bloodline, believing it was his sword to wield. And now, that very sword was in my hand. The accumulated pain of a lifetime of being dismissed and made to feel like an outsider suddenly crystallized. It wasn't just a chaotic mass of hurt anymore, it was fuel. It was a clear, defined objective. I was no longer the victim of a lie, I was the keeper of the truth. It's a strange feeling when your entire life is rewritten in a single sentence. The pain doesn't just vanish, but it changes. If you've ever had a moment where you felt completely invisible to your family, hit that like button and comment, I see you below to support everyone else who's been there. I looked at my mother, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than resentment. It was a distant, clinical sympathy for a woman trapped in her own kind of prison. But there was no time for that now. The mission came first. I need to see Uncle James, I said, and my voice was no longer that of a wounded daughter. It was the voice of Captain Caitlin Reed. We need irrefutable proof. The decision made in the coffee shop propelled me into motion. The drive to my Uncle James's apartment in Center City, Philadelphia, felt less like a family visit and more like a reconnaissance mission into unsecured territory. Every traffic light, every turn onto a new street was a calculated step into the unknown. I had no intel on how he would react. Would he see me as family, or would he brand me a troublemaker, just another disruption to the carefully curated Blackwell narrative? His building was a sleek, modern high-rise of glass and steel, a stark contrast to the suffocating, old-world stone of the Blackwell estate. The air in the lobby was clean, smelling faintly of citrus, a world away from the scent of decaying tradition and cigar smoke I had just escaped. When he opened the door to his apartment, the difference was immediate and absolute. His eyes, the same shade of deep blue as my own, held a genuine curiosity and concern, not the cold judgment I was so accustomed to. His home smelled of freshly ground coffee and old books, the aroma of knowledge, not of power. I knew, with the certainty of a soldier finding a defensible position, that I had come to the right place. We sat on a minimalist gray leather sofa, a city skyline sprawling out from the floor-to-ceiling window behind him. There was no pretense, no small talk. I launched directly into my situation report, delivering the facts with the clipped precision of a briefing to a superior officer. I stripped away the emotion, focusing only on the sequence of events. The confrontation with Douglas, his vile accusations, his sworn oath on blood purity, and finally, my mother's battlefield confession. James listened without interruption, his hands clasped together, his sharp eyes analyzing every word. He didn't register shock or surprise. He looked like a scientist presented with a complex problem, his mind methodically deconstructing it layer by layer. When I finished, the silence in the room was analytical, not awkward. He simply nodded. Douglas's logic has a fatal flaw, he said finally, his voice calm and measured. He attacks your standing based on his own rigid criteria, but fails to apply those same criteria to himself. It's an arrogant oversight. He leaned forward. We need data, hard evidence, something irrefutable. He suggested a DNA test immediately. It was a clean, decisive, logical solution. For the first time in days, I felt the ground solidify beneath my feet. I wasn't just a girl who had been hurt. I was an operative who had just secured her first strategic ally. The relief was immense, a quiet exhalation I didn't realize I'd been holding. That evening, buoyed by this newfound sense of partnership, I made a tactical error. I called my older brother, Thomas, hoping to recruit more support to our cause. His voice on the other end of the line was heavy with a manufactured weariness. "Caitlin, listen," he sighed, the sound of a man deeply inconvenienced. "Dad is under a lot of stress right now. Just don't make things worse, okay? You know how he gets when he's angry." "This isn't anger, Thomas," I tried to explain, keeping my voice even. "This is a calculated plan to disinherit me based on a lie." I heard a scoff from the other end. William, my other brother, was on the line too. "Oh, for God's sake, Kate," he cut in, his tone dripping with condescension. "Why do you always have to be so dramatic? It's just some money. Just accept whatever you're given and let the family have some peace." A cold fury began to snake its way up my spine. "My share is 0, William," I said, my voice dropping. "So what? You've got your army salary, don't you?" he shot back, as if that settled the matter. They didn't understand. Or rather, they didn't want to. They had already weighed their options. On one side was their sister and the inconvenient truth. On the other was their father, their inheritance, and a lifetime of comfortable lies. They had chosen their side. The feeling of isolation that washed over me was more acute, more painful than anything Douglas had said. Douglas was the enemy I expected. This was a flank attack from my own lines. They were my brothers, and they had just abandoned me on the battlefield. I ended the call without another word, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I stared out of James's window at the glittering expanse of the city lights below, a sprawling map of a foreign galaxy. I was truly alone in this fight. For a moment, doubt, the most insidious of enemies, began its infiltration. Was I the one destroying everything? Was I selfishly tearing apart the family for my own pride? Then, a quote we had studied at West Point from Martin Luther King Jr. echoed in my mind. "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. This was my time of challenge. Anyone can stand for the truth when it costs them nothing. But to stand for it when you are utterly alone, when even your own blood has turned against you, that is the definition of honor. The gnawing sense of loneliness didn't vanish, but it transformed. It hardened, crystallizing into a cold, steely resolve. Douglas, Thomas, William. They had all made their choice. They had chosen the path of convenience. Now I would walk my own path. The path of controversy. The path of truth. And I would not take a single step back. After we had sent our DNA samples to the lab, sealed and dispatched like critical intelligence, James put a hand on my shoulder. His touch was gentle, but firm. "You're not going back to that house alone, Caitlin," he stated, not as a suggestion, but as a quiet order. "It's no longer a safe zone." He insisted I stay in his spare room. That evening, as he showed me where to put my things, he gave me a small, wry smile. "Welcome to Forward Operating Base Blackwell," he said. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a genuine laugh escaped me. He got it. He understood my language, my world. He saw the soldier in me not as a rebellion, but as a part of who I was. His apartment became my sanctuary, a demilitarized zone from the psychological warfare of my former life. There were no judgmental stares over the rim of a crystal glass, no backhanded compliments disguised as jokes. There was only the quiet company of books, the smooth, thoughtful notes of a Miles Davis record playing softly in the background, and conversations that roamed freely from molecular biology to military history. Anything and everything that wasn't the suffocating drama of the Blackwell clan. Here, I wasn't the disappointment or the troublemaker. I was just Caitlin. The relief was so profound it was almost disorienting. A few evenings later, a delicious scent began to fill the apartment. The savory, unmistakable aroma of sizzling steak and caramelized onions. I walked into the kitchen to find James at the stove, expertly flipping thinly sliced beef on a griddle. He was making Philly cheesesteaks. "Your grandmother used to make these for me every time I came home from college," he said, his eyes focused on his work. "She said it was the smell of home." We ate them in a comfortable silence, sitting at his small dining table, overlooking the city. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of a Blackwell family dinner, where words were weapons and silence was a ceasefire. This was a peaceful quiet, a shared moment of simple contentment. After we finished, he disappeared into his study and returned with a dusty, leather-bound photo album. He handled it with a reverence that told me it was a sacred object. He carefully turned the brittle pages until he found what he was looking for. It was a faded photograph, slightly blurred, of a much younger James awkwardly holding a tiny, swaddled newborn. The baby had a tuft of dark hair and a ridiculously determined look on her face. "That's you and me," he said softly, a tender smile touching his lips. He tapped the picture. "This one had the loudest laugh in the hospital. The nurses all said so." He looked at me, his eyes holding a warmth I had starved for my entire life. "I knew right then you were going to be a fighter." Tears welled in my eyes, hot and unexpected. They streamed down my face before I could stop them. In 27 years, Douglas had never told me a single story about my infancy. He had never shared a memory, never offered a glimpse into a time when I was just a child, before I had become a ledger of his disappointments. With one old photograph, one small forgotten memory, James had given me back a piece of my own history. A past I never even knew I had lost. He had seen me, not as a title or a problem, but as a person with a beginning. Our fragile peace was shattered by the shrill ring of my cell phone. The caller ID read Harrison Mills. I answered, putting the phone on speaker. His voice oozed through the receiver, slick with a false sincerity that set my teeth on edge. "Ms. Reed, good evening," he began. "I'm calling to inform you that, due to some unforeseen complications, the reading of Mrs. Blackwell's will has been postponed by 1 week." I gripped my phone, my knuckles turning white, a classic delaying tactic. Douglas and his legal pit bull were preparing a new line of attack, maneuvering their forces while they tried to keep us pinned down. The familiar, cold anger I felt in Douglas's presence began to rise in my chest. But this time, something was different. I wasn't alone. James calmly reached over and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. His gaze was steady, analytical. "It's all right," he said quietly, his voice a ballast in the sudden storm. "This gives us more time to prepare." He looked me straight in the eyes, a flicker of strategic light in them. "They're reacting to us, Caitlin. That means they're scared." He had taken a piece of bad news, a move designed to intimidate us, and instantly reframed it as a tactical advantage. He saw the chessboard just as I did. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The condescending voices of my brothers, Harrison's slimy tone, the weight of the coming battle, it all swirled in my head in a relentless vortex. Giving up, I slipped out of bed and went into the living room. The only light was a single, warm lamp, illuminating James as he sat in an armchair, reading. He looked up as I entered, his expression gentle. "The storm will pass, Caitlin," he said, as if reading my mind. He knew this fight was taking its toll. "Your grandmother was a woman of deep faith. She always believed that even in the darkest night, there is a refuge." He gestured to a bookshelf beside him, to a well-worn, leather-bound Bible that I recognized as hers. "Psalm 46:1, he said, his voice soft but sure. "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." I'm not a religious person. I find my faith in mission, in discipline, in the men and women I serve with. But hearing those ancient words, spoken by this kind, brilliant man, my father, they landed with a profound sense of peace. It wasn't about theology. It was about finding a safe harbor in the middle of a war. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that whatever hell Douglas was about to unleash, I had finally found mine. James was right. They were scared. And their fear manifested as a strange, unnerving silence for the next 2 days. There were no more calls from Harrison Mills, no provocative texts from Douglas. In my line of work, we have a name for this: the enemy preparing the battlefield. It's the quiet before an artillery strike, a silence more menacing than any direct assault. We use the time to shore up our own defenses. We managed to get a hold of Bernard Walsh, my grandmother's personal lawyer, a man whose integrity was legendary. He was on a long overdue vacation in the Caribbean, but the moment he heard the urgency in my voice, his tone shifted from relaxed to razor-sharp. "Be careful, Captain," he'd warned over the crackling long-distance line. "Your grandmother was an exceptionally shrewd woman. Her will is constructed like a fortress. Douglas won't be able to break it with brute force, so he'll resort to subterfuge." That subterfuge arrived not with a lawyer's letter, but with a Trojan horse wrapped in family sentiment. The call came from a number I hadn't seen in over a year. My Aunt Mildred, Douglas's younger sister. Her voice was a syrupy concoction of feigned concern and theatrical sobs. "Caitlin, darling, I heard there was some unpleasantness," she began, her voice catching dramatically. "What are you doing, sweetie? Your father is just beside himself with grief. He has dedicated his entire life to you, gave you a name, a home. How can you do this to him over a little bit of money?" Every word was a carefully aimed dart dipped in the poison of guilt. This was a classic psychological operation, a textbook psyop. Use a seemingly harmless, familiar face to deliver a message designed to erode morale. "Aunt Mildred, it's not what you think," I said, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "It doesn't matter what I think," she snapped, the phony sadness instantly replaced by a sharp, accusatory edge. "He is your father. You are tearing this family apart, do you hear me? Your own mother will never forgive you for this." I hung up, my hand trembling slightly. They were deploying family members as emotional weapons, using their love and history as shrapnel. James, who had overheard the conversation, simply shook his head. "Predictable," he murmured, "and desperate." The next wave of the assault came less than an hour later. A text message from Thomas. The weary, inconvenienced tone from our last call was gone, replaced by something colder, more menacing. "Dad says if you don't stop this, he's cutting off all financial support for Mom. Think about her, Caitlin." I read the text twice, the words blurring. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was one thing to be disowned, to be insulted, to be abandoned by my brothers. This was different. This was a hostage situation. Douglas was using my mother, the woman whose life he had already controlled for decades, as a human shield. The sheer cowardice of it made me physically ill. A wave of conflict, sharp and agonizing, tore through me. I was fighting for the truth, for my grandmother's real legacy. But what if the price of that truth was my mother's well-being? She wasn't strong like my grandmother. She was fragile, a casualty of a war she never signed up for. I must have looked as pale as I felt, because James put down his book and looked at me with deep concern. I showed him the phone. His expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "This is not strength, Caitlin," he said, his voice low and firm. "This is the act of a desperate man who knows he is losing control. He is using your love for your mother as a weapon against you. Do not let him." His words were a splash of cold water cutting through the fog of guilt and fear. He was right. This wasn't a show of power, it was a confession of weakness. But that night, as I lay in bed, the walls of the quiet apartment felt like they were closing in. Aunt Mildred's manufactured sobs, Thomas's cold-blooded threat, they echoed in my ears. "You are tearing this family apart. Think about her, Caitlin. Was I being selfish? Was my fight for justice just a selfish crusade that would leave a trail of destruction?" Unable to lie still, I got up and opened my laptop. I scrolled through old photos, a digital archive of a life that now felt like a lie. I stopped on one. It was from my West Point graduation. I was in my full-dress uniform, and my grandmother Eleanor stood beside me, her small frame radiating an immense power. She was whispering something in my ear, a huge grin on her face, and I was laughing. I remembered her words perfectly. They came back to me with the clarity of a direct order. "Don't you ever," she had whispered, her voice fierce and full of love, "let anyone tell you that you are not worthy, not even if they bear the Blackwell name." It wasn't just advice, it was a directive, a mission assignment from my true commander. She had known this day might come. She had seen the battlefield long before I had. She had trusted me to fight. In that instant, the suffocating guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, clarifying rage. Douglas had crossed a line from which there was no return. He hadn't just insulted me or tried to steal my inheritance. He had threatened my mother and, in doing so, had desecrated the very idea of family he claimed to protect. He had declared a total war. And I would make him regret it. The final straw wasn't a phone call. It wasn't a threat. It was an act. A calculated act of profound contempt designed to break me. The next morning, the doorman buzzed the apartment. "Captain Reed," he said, his voice hesitant, "there's a delivery for you downstairs on the sidewalk." A delivery? I wasn't expecting anything. James and I rode the elevator down, a knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. The moment the elevator doors opened to the lobby, I saw them through the glass doors. Sitting unceremoniously on the public sidewalk were 3 shoddy cardboard boxes, sealed with hastily slapped packing tape. We stepped outside into the crisp morning air. On the side of each box, scrawled in a crude, angry script with a thick black marker, were 3 words. "Old stuff, see, read." My blood ran cold. James placed a steadying hand on my arm as I knelt and carefully sliced open the tape on the top box with my pocket knife. Inside, thrown together without care, were the few personal belongings I'd left at the estate. Some old paperbacks, a few changes of clothes, and there, lying face up on top of a folded sweater, was the silver-framed photograph of me and my grandmother, the one Douglas had knocked to the floor in her study. He had sent his staff to pack up my life, to sweep away any evidence that I had ever existed within those walls, and then had it all dumped on the street like garbage. This was more than an insult. It was a declaration. It was an erasure. You do not exist. You do not belong. The rage I had been methodically suppressing for days, the cold, tactical anger of a soldier, finally broke its chains. It erupted, hot and volcanic, a force of nature that burned away every last trace of doubt and hesitation. I stood up, pulled out my phone, and dialed Douglas's number. There were no more tactics, no more poker faces, only the raw, unfiltered truth. He answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Well, what is it, Caitlin? Did you get my gift?" "You've made a fatal mistake, Douglas," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. The smugness in his voice faltered for a fraction of a second. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "You think you can erase me?" I continued, my voice dangerously low. "You think you can pack 27 years of a life into a cardboard box and throw it away?" "Don't you dare!" I suddenly screamed, the sound tearing from my throat with a violence that made James flinch. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the years of being made to feel small and insignificant. It all poured out in that one ragged shout. "Don't you dare pretend you don't know what you did. You crossed the final line." The silence on the other end was heavy, stunned. "This war," I said, my voice now dropping back to that icy, controlled calm, "isn't ending with me walking away quietly with my tail between my legs. It's going to end with the truth being broadcast for the entire world to see. You wanted a war over bloodlines? You're going to get one." A strangled roar came through the phone. "You dare threaten me? In my own family?" "That's not a threat," I replied, and my voice was now utterly devoid of emotion. It was the calm of a sniper settling the crosshairs on a target. "It's a situation report. You have fundamentally misjudged your opponent. You thought I was still that little girl you could bully into silence. You thought I was some weak, emotional woman you could manipulate." I took a breath, letting the words hang in the air between us. "You forgot who I am. I am Captain Caitlin Reed, United States Army. I was trained to anticipate, confront, and neutralize tyrants just like you. And I will not stand down. I will not be erased. And I will not be silenced." I ended the call before he could utter another word. The sudden silence on the Philadelphia sidewalk was absolute. I looked at James, whose face was a mixture of shock and profound pride. "It's time," I said, my voice steady. "No more defense. It's time to counter-attack." Walking back into the apartment, I felt as though a crushing, invisible weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For my entire life, I had, without realizing it, given Douglas power over me. I had craved his approval, his respect, some small acknowledgement that I was worthy. And that deep, unfulfilled need was the chain he had used to bind me. Eleanor Roosevelt was right. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. He had made me feel inferior for 27 years because on some level, I had consented. I had kept hoping, kept trying, kept playing by the rules of his toxic game. But not anymore. Consent revoked. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you finally drew a line in the sand and decided you would not be silenced anymore? If you have, hit the like button and just type "consent revoked" in the comments below. Let's see how many of us there are. I walked over to my laptop and opened it. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a newfound purpose as I began to draft an email to Bernard Walsh. The plan of action formed in my mind with perfect military clarity. Phase 1, intelligence gathering, was complete. Phase 2, alliance building, was secure. It was time for Phase 3, a full frontal assault. The game had changed, and I was now in command. The vow had been made. The defensive posture was abandoned. Phase 3 had begun. James's apartment ceased to be a home and transformed into a war room. We repurposed his large mahogany dining table into our command center. Laptops sat open, and legal pads filled with notes were spread across the surface. The quiet jazz was replaced by a tense, focused silence, broken only by the clicking of keyboards and the low murmur of strategic discussion. The first asset for our offensive arrived via a secure email. It was from the lab. I opened the attached PDF, my heart rate steady, my eyes scanning the technical jargon until they locked on the conclusion. There it was, in crisp black and white digital print. Probability of paternity, 99.9998%. It wasn't a moment of emotional revelation, it was a moment of tactical victory. This was our silver bullet. the irrefutable proof that nullified Douglas's entire premise. I printed the report, the paper warm from the laser printer, and slid it into a fresh manila folder. On the tab, I wrote in clean block letters, Operation Blackwell. With the methodical mind of a scientist, James began constructing a timeline on a large whiteboard, mapping every key event, every known lie, every threat Douglas had made. It was a visual representation of our enemy's psychological profile. "We have to anticipate his next move," James said, tapping the name Harrison Mills on the board with a dry erase marker. "Mills will be his primary weapon for any legal attacks. He's slippery. We need to find a way to neutralize him before he can neutralize us." I nodded, a quote from Sun Tzu's The Art of War. A required text at West Point echoing in my mind. "Know thy enemy and know yourself. In 100 battles, you will never be in peril." We knew Douglas's weakness, his towering arrogance and his fanatical obsession with bloodline purity. Now, we had to fortify our own lines against his inevitable counterattack. That counterattack came sooner and from a more insidious direction than we expected. My phone rang, and it was my mother, her voice thin and laced with panic. "Caitlin, honey, it's Bernard Walsh," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He's been hospitalized. They're saying it was a massive heart attack." The air left my lungs. Bernard, the one man who understood the fortress my grandmother had built into her will. The one lawyer Douglas couldn't buy or bully. "A heart attack?" James repeated softly from across the room, his eyes narrowed in deep suspicion. "The day before the rescheduled reading of the will." What a convenient coincidence for Douglas. A cold dread crept over the room. We had no proof. Nothing but the gut instinct of a soldier who has seen too many convenient coincidences on the battlefield. This wasn't random. This was a targeted strike. Douglas and Harrison were systematically removing our support systems, trying to isolate us, to force us into the fight without legal counsel, hoping we'd panic and make a mistake. The feeling of being cornered, of the walls closing in, returned with a vengeance. But this time, it didn't bring despair. It sharpened my resolve into a diamond-hard point. Just as James predicted, Harrison Mills made his move. He called to summon us to an emergency reconciliation meeting at his downtown law office. We walked into the lion's den, prepared for anything. The office was a sterile cathedral of glass, steel, and muted gray tones, designed to make you feel small and insignificant. Harrison didn't waste time on pleasantries. He sat behind a desk the size of a small car, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Ms. Reed," he began, his voice smooth and patronizing, "my client, Mr. Blackwell, is aware of your paternity test." He let the words hang in the air. To avoid any further damage to the family's reputation, he is prepared to make a generous offer, $250,000. In exchange, you will sign this non-disclosure agreement and relinquish any and all claims to the estate. He slid a thick document across the desk. It was the final, ultimate insult. A last-ditch attempt to buy my silence, to put a price tag on my identity. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Do you remember what Douglas said, Mr. Mills? His exact words were, 'This estate will stay with the true Blackwell bloodline.'" According to this DNA test, I patted the folder in my lap. That makes me the only person in this room, besides my father James, with a direct biological claim. Your offer is an insult. The smirk vanished from Harrison's face, replaced by a strange, knowing little smile that chilled me more than his arrogance had. "You're tough, Captain. I'll give you that," he said softly. "But you don't understand the legal complexities at play here." His veiled threat lingered in the air long after we left his office. What complexities? What did he know that we didn't? The unease settled deep in my gut. That night, the answer arrived. James received a call from an old colleague, a quiet, unassuming man who worked as an archivist for the city of Philadelphia. "James, it's Mark," the man said, his voice low. "I was digitizing some old sealed probate records, and a name flagged an alert you set up years ago. I found something you might be interested in, a sealed adoption file from the early 1970s, under the name Blackwell. The next morning, a certified copy of the file was on our dining table. My hands were steady as I opened the folder. The documents were old, typewritten on what was now yellowed paper. And there, on the first page, was a name that caused the entire world to tilt on its axis. Douglas Blackwell, born Daniel Miller. Legally adopted by my grandparents at 6 months of age. His entire life. His crusade for purity, his obsession with bloodline, his contempt for me as an outsider. It was all built on a foundation of lies. He wasn't a Blackwell by blood. He was the very thing he despised. The conference room at Harrison Mills's law firm was as cold and opulent as a modern mausoleum. Sunlight struggled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the sterile space but offering no warmth. The air was still and smelled faintly of expensive leather and industrial-strength cleaner, a scent designed to erase any trace of human emotion. It felt like a stage set for an execution. Douglas sat at the head of the long polished mahogany table, the very picture of a king presiding over a trial he had already won. His posture was relaxed, his expression one of bored confidence. He wore a navy blue suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin, a symbol of the effortless power he wielded. My brothers, Thomas and William, sat on either side of him like well-dressed sentinels, their eyes fixed on the glossy surface of the table, pointedly avoiding my gaze. They had chosen their king, and now they were here to witness his final victory. James and I entered not as the accused, but as executioners of a different sort. We were there to execute the truth. I walked to my designated seat across from them and placed my leather briefcase on the table. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that echoed in the silent room, a deliberate sound that broke the sterile peace. Every head snapped in my direction. I could feel the accelerated rhythm of my own heart, a steady, powerful drumbeat against my ribs, the body's natural response to impending combat. But on the outside, I was perfectly still. My seer training had taught me this. When the storm hits, become the eye. Let the chaos swirl around you. Remain silent, focused, ready. Harrison Mills, looking smug in his $1,000 suit, cleared his throat to begin the proceedings. He made a show of shuffling some papers, a needless bit of theater. We are here to execute the last will and testament of Eleanor Blackwell. He began, his voice oozing a false, syrupy solemnity. However, he said, pausing for dramatic effect, letting the weight of his next words fill the room. Before we proceed, an issue has been raised that requires clarification regarding the eligibility of the listed heirs. His gaze slid to me, cold and reptilian. I felt it like a physical touch. Specifically, he continued, the bloodline of one Captain Caitlin Reed. On cue, as if they had rehearsed it a dozen times, Douglas sat forward. I have evidence right here, he announced, his voice booming with the unshakable authority of a man who had never been told no. He pushed a folder across the table. It slid silently across the polished wood, coming to a stop directly in the center. A certified DNA analysis proving conclusively that Caitlin Reed does not carry my blood. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, the picture of triumph. The checkmate move. He scanned the room, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips, certain he had just delivered the killing blow. A heavy silence fell, thick with anticipation, everyone waiting for my collapse, my tears, my surrender. I did not collapse. Instead, I calmly reached for my own briefcase, unlatched it, and retrieved a matching manila folder. How interesting, I said, my voice even and measured, cutting through the silence. Because I have a DNA analysis here as well. I slid my own folder across the table, where it came to rest beside his. I had made copies for everyone. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the world as my brothers and Harrison reluctantly opened their files. I watched their eyes scan the page, saw the first flicker of confusion. This report, I continued, my eyes locked on Douglas, refusing to let him look away, confirms with 99.98% certainty that James Blackwell is my biological father, which of course makes me the direct, biological granddaughter of Eleanor Blackwell. A low murmur rippled through the room. Thomas and William stared at the paper, then shot confused, panicked looks from me to James, then back to their father, as if searching for an explanation. Their carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture at the edges. Harrison Mills, ever the snake, tried to regain control, his face flushing. This is an interesting development, but it changes nothing, he sputtered, his professional composure cracking just enough to show the panic underneath. It does not change the fact that you are not the daughter of Douglas Blackwell. You are correct, Harrison, James said, standing up. His voice, usually so calm and academic, now resonated with a newfound power that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. It does not change that fact, but it illuminates a far more important one. With a slow, deliberate movement, James placed a third folder on the table. This one was thicker, its contents bound by a simple clip. It landed softly, but it felt like a bomb had been armed. This, he announced, his voice clear and steady, is the official, sealed adoption record for Douglas Blackwell, born Daniel Miller. Absolute, profound silence. It was a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The color drained from Douglas's face. He stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. His confident smirk dissolved, melting away into a mask of slack-jawed horror. The king was dethroned, stripped bare in front of his entire court in the space of a single heartbeat. I watched my brothers. The raw, unfiltered shock on their faces was a sight to behold. The confusion morphed into a dawning, sickening realization, and then, finally, into pure, unadulterated disgust. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were staring at the man they called their father, truly seeing him for the first time. Not as a patriarch, but as a hypocrite, a fraud. The very foundation of their entire lives, their name, their privilege, had just been vaporized. James let the silence hang for a moment longer, letting the poison of the truth do its work before delivering the final, devastating blow. If we are to apply the draconian standard of blood purity that Douglas himself has so vehemently established, he said, his voice ringing with the clarity of a bell, then the only people in this room who are true biological Blackwells are my daughter, Caitlin, and myself. At that exact moment, as if summoned by the declaration of justice, the heavy conference room door swung open. Bernard Walsh, my grandmother's lawyer, stepped inside. He looked tired, a little pale, but his eyes were sharp and resolute as steel. My apologies for the delay, he said, his gaze sweeping across the room and taking in the scene of utter devastation. It appears I've arrived at the perfect moment to ensure my client's final wishes are carried out. Properly. The cavalry had arrived. The battle was won. The explosion had happened. Now came the fallout. In the stunned, ringing silence of the conference room, Bernard Walsh took command. He walked to the head of the table, his presence filling the power vacuum left by Douglas's utter collapse. He cleared his throat, and the sound was like a gavel calling the shattered room to order. As the executor of Eleanor Blackwell's estate, Bernard said, his voice firm and steady, and in light of the extraordinary circumstances that have come to light, I have been instructed to unseal a final letter. He produced a cream-colored envelope from his briefcase. It was sealed with my grandmother's distinctive wax stamp. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter within. To my family, he began to read, his voice resonating with a solemn grace. The words were my grandmother's, but they felt like a voice from beyond the grave, delivering a final, irrefutable judgment. I know everything, the letter read. I know that Douglas was not born of my blood, but I have loved him as my own son. And I know that Caitlin is the daughter of my son James, and I have cherished the warrior's spirit that flows in her veins. The letter was a masterpiece of quiet devastation. It didn't rage, it mourned. It laid bare every secret with a profound and heavy sadness. She wrote of her hope that Douglas would one day overcome the deep-seated insecurity that drove him, but that he had instead chosen a path of fear, deceit, and hypocrisy. The legacy of the Blackwells was never about blood, Bernard read, his voice dropping slightly. It is about honor. And in his quest to hoard a legacy he felt he did not deserve, Douglas, my son, you have stripped yourself of the only inheritance that truly mattered. It was the final, killing blow. Not delivered by me, not by James, but by the very woman whose memory Douglas had tried to weaponize. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. The tyrant was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man. He just sat there, utterly vacant, staring at nothing. A man whose entire identity had been publicly executed. I watched as Thomas and William looked at him, and I saw no pity in their eyes, only a cold, dawning horror mixed with revulsion. Their entire lives had been a lie, orchestrated by a man they now saw was weaker than any of them. When Bernard announced the terms of the will, that the bulk of the estate, including the Blackwell mansion, was to be placed in a trust managed by James and myself, something inside Douglas finally snapped. He lurched to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His face was a contorted mask of desperation. "You promised!" he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Your promise." I met his wild gaze, and my own voice was devoid of all emotion. It was as clean and precise as a sniper's shot. "No," I said calmly. "You made a promise about bloodline. I simply asked if you intended to keep it. You didn't." The chaos that followed was a blur. Douglas, flanked by his two shell-shocked sons, scrambled out of the room in a cloud of shame and humiliation. Harrison Mills muttered some pathetic excuse and scurried after them. And then, there was peace. My mother, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room the entire time, walked towards me. Her eyes were filled with tears, but for the first time, they were not tears of fear. "I'm so proud of you, Caitlin," she whispered. She then turned and did something I never thought I would see. She walked over to where James stood and, without a word, wrapped her arms around him. It was a moment of quiet, profound healing. But as I watched them, I knew that the victory had come at a cost, and that things could never go back to the way they were. New lines had to be drawn. In the military, after you take an objective, the most critical phase is consolidating your position. You establish a defensive perimeter to repel any counterattacks and secure your hard-won ground. The battle might be over, but protecting the peace is a new, ongoing mission. That evening, I called my mother. "Mom, I love you," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "But I need space. I need time to heal from everything connected to Douglas, from all of it." I wasn't punishing her. I was building my perimeter. A few days later, a call came from a number I didn't recognize. It was Thomas. His voice was thick with a remorse that sounded genuine, but it was too little, too late. "Kate," he said, Can we talk?" "I need time, Thomas," I replied, my voice cool but not cruel. "You chose your side on the battlefield. Now I need to choose mine." I was consolidating my position. Later that week, I stood alone in my grandmother's study. The scent of old leather and lemon polish was the same, but the room felt different. Bigger. Quieter. I had won. Justice, in its own brutal way, had been served. But I didn't feel the elation of victory. I just felt a bone-deep exhaustion, and a quiet, aching sadness that settled in my chest like a heavy stone. In winning this war, I had lost the man I once called a father. I had lost 2 brothers. I had lost the illusion of a family I'd spent my entire life trying to earn a place in. Victory has a price. I looked out the large window at the sprawling lawn of the estate. The magnificent old oak trees were shedding their leaves, the brilliant reds and golds of autumn giving way to the stark, bare branches of winter. It felt right. A season in my life had ended. A new one was beginning, uncertain, exposed, but filled with a quiet, fragile hope. The healing would be another kind of war. A quieter one, fought not in a conference room, but in the silent chambers of my own heart. And it was a war I knew I had to fight alone. Several months passed. The stark, bare branches of winter gave way to the tentative green shoots of a Philadelphia spring. The quiet, internal war of healing I'd anticipated was less of a battle and more of a slow, deliberate reconstruction. I stood in the grand foyer of the Blackwell mansion, but it was no longer the cold, echoing museum of painful memories it once was. The oppressive silence was gone. In its place, the smooth, soulful notes of a Miles Davis record drifted from the living room. The air smelled not of stale regret, but of fresh paint, lemon polish, and the rich aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Working with James, we had transformed it. It was no longer the Blackwell estate, it was our home. We kept my grandmother's study exactly as she had left it, a perfect, preserved sanctuary of her memory. But the rest of the house, we filled with life. We replaced heavy, dark drapes with ones that let the sunlight flood in. We filled the rooms with books, music, and laughter. We were redefining what it meant to be a Blackwell, one day at a time. When Thanksgiving arrived, it was the first one in my life where I felt truly thankful. The long mahogany dining table, once a stage for Douglas's monologues and my own invisibility, was now a place of warmth and genuine connection. There were no tense silences, no judgmental glares, no passive-aggressive remarks. It was just me, my father James, and my mother, who was slowly, tentatively, finding herself again, her smile less fragile than it had been in years. We had invited a few of James's close colleagues and a couple of my old friends from high school. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. We talked about science, about art, about football, about the future. For the first time, the house was filled with the sounds of a real family. One crisp afternoon, as the late sunlight streamed into my grandmother's study, James and I sat in her high-backed leather chairs, a comfortable silence between us. He reached over and handed me a small velvet-covered box. "Eleanor wanted you to have this," he said softly. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was a pair of tarnished silver captain's bars. They were old, from a different era. "They belonged to your grandfather," James explained. "My father. He wore them in Korea. Your grandmother kept them for you. She always said you had the heart of a soldier, just like him." I picked up the insignia, the cool, heavy metal resting in my palm. I could feel the weight of history, of a lineage not defined by a name on a legal document, but by a spirit passed down through generations. This was the true bloodline: honor, sacrifice, strength. "We can't get back the time we lost," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "No, we can't," James said, his eyes kind. He reached over and gently squeezed my hand. "But we can build from now on." He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "That's all any of us can do, Captain." The inheritance was more than just a house and a portfolio of investments. It was a weight, built on a foundation of pain and secrets. I knew I couldn't simply keep it for myself. It had to be transformed. Sitting in that study, beneath the watchful gaze of my grandmother's oil portrait, I knew what I had to do. I worked with Bernard Walsh, no longer just a lawyer, but a trusted family advisor. Together, we established the legal framework for a new foundation. We called it the Eleanor Blackwell Warrior Scholar Fund. Its mission was simple: to provide full academic scholarships for exceptional female veterans seeking to build a new future after their military service. It was for women like me, women who had chosen a difficult path, who had served with honor and now deserved a chance to write their next chapter. It was how I would truly honor my grandmother's legacy, not by hoarding the wealth she had left, but by deploying it as she would have, as a tool to empower, to lift up, to reward the warrior spirit she so admired. It was a way to honor us both. My military leave was coming to an end. Soon I would be rejoining my unit, returning to my life of service, but I would be returning as a different person. I was no longer a soldier fighting to prove her worth to a father who would never see it. I was no longer the outsider, peering through the glass at a family I desperately wanted to belong to. I was a soldier who knew exactly who she was, where she came from, and what she was fighting for. The greatest legacy Eleanor Blackwell had left me wasn't in a bank vault. It was inside of me. It was the truth. It was honor. It was the strength to take the deepest scars of my life and transform them into guiding stars for others to follow. On my last day at the house, I stood in my dress uniform before my grandmother's portrait. I looked into her painted eyes, so full of intelligence and fierce love, and I felt a profound sense of peace. I raised my hand to my brow in a crisp, formal salute. A soldier, reporting to her general. Mission accomplished. With honors. Thank you for joining me on this journey. This fight taught me that legacy isn't something you're given, it's something you build. And family isn't always the one you're born into, but the one you forge in loyalty and truth. This story is dedicated to everyone who has had to stand alone to find their own strength and define their own honor. If you believe in the power of resilience, please support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing. And I'd be honored if you would share one word in the comments that describes your own source of strength. Thank you for listening.